1, 2, 1, 2, and through and through. The vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head, he went galumphing back.
Galumphing back.
Yeah. So how did you get into composition?
That's sort of a circuitous story. I mean, I was working in the theater, I was working professionally, and then I lived in New York, and I had always done music. I'd always grown up studying piano and then voice, and I just was very curious I was always creating things, and then I wanted to know more about that. I found an amazing voice teacher when I was living in New York, Dee Kohana, who had studied with Jan Degatani, but she was a jazz singer.
Wow.
So she had this incredible creative toolkit and just an amazing person. And so I found her, I think in the back of the Village Voice, like an app. Can you believe that? And so I would go to Brooklyn once a week. Anyway, she just taught me so much, and it was, and I ended up going to Berkeley first, and in Boston, and yeah. So I was there, doing jazz, but also starting to write, singing with a band from New England Conservatory, a bunch of people from New England Conservatory. We had this crazy, wonderful band, Dance Real, and shout out to the guys in Dance Real. And then I started meeting composers, and I, had this voice that could do a lot of things that they were interested in, a lot of range and experimentation, and so I started connecting with composers, wonderful composers like Wes York, and Bob Aldridge, and then started to get really curious about how they did that and what was that, and then I started doing it myself a little more and was more curious about that. Curiouser and curiouser, right? That's how I got into composing. Curiouser and curiouser, and then it ended up at MSM to really dig into composition. So.
Yeah, where do you kind of start your creative process? Is it through the text or through improvisation, or depends?
It really depends on the piece. I mean, sometimes something can be extremely through composed, and improvisation sometimes serves in a piece. It depends on who you're doing it with, right? Because the rest of that piece is largely composed, but it depends on. You want to. I feel one of the most exciting things is to bring out as much creativity in the performers as possible. So sometimes that may involve improvisation, but with some people that may not be the best thing for them, and so I think you need to find, right, a symphony orchestra. Maybe they're not going to quite have as much fun with that. But so I think it's about what is going to be what's going to ignite the most creativity in whatever it is.
What do you find interesting about notation, about music notation?
Notation, everything. Yeah. Notation is so amazing, isn't it? It's capturing music, and then it becomes a tool to convey music. So to me, it's several things. And again, before theater was actually visual art, so I think very visually, and my scores actually come a lot, even more and more. I'm finding through drawing and through the visual concept, or capturing the notation that way first. And so, I just think there's so much that's another part of our brain that we can use with music to capture it into a score. And then, like I say, then it's this living thing itself that has its own integrity and suggests all kinds of other things, and I feel like it should be animated, it should, right? It should move. I love using color now, Anyway, so then it becomes, again, this vehicle that ignites a performance, it ignites something else, and then you take that performance and you adjust the score. To me it's a very living thing, and it's also a wonderful, like, when I'm looking at a score, I feel like it's this connection to a composer. It's a sort of a portal through time. Like, I remember doing a Debussy song and being sort of, wait, there's a slur here, and that same passage is here with a slur, but this one has staccatos, and that one doesn't have staccatos. It's just like, what is he saying? What are you saying to me? It feels so. I feel that too when I'm putting something on the score. That sort of communication.
Yeah. What kind of inspired you to write this piece?
It was an experiment. So I was really interested, having come from theater first, at that time. So this is in the 80s. I was working professionally in the theater, and I think still it continues, but there was a real emphasis on the visual aspect of theater, and there were a lot of directors I was working with. For instance, Robert Wilson is a director I'd worked with, and so the idea of the visual world of theater was so huge at that time, and the vision of all that. And there was also the wave of videos, and so many things were starting, right? Our whole world became very visual, which again continues to this day. And I was so curious if we were still able to hear a story, and have our own inner vision, was the kind of question I was asking myself. So there were a couple of things about this. One is that it's a fantastical language, so there's a whole world of sounds and imagery that already unleashes our imagination. But there's a distinct story that's being told, right? And we have this monster, the Jabberwocky. And I was really curious if we could tell this story. I was also really drawn to the story because of all the vocal, fun in just saying the language. But I was really curious if I could tell this story, and again, Lewis Carroll really did create it for his brothers and sisters to be this like an old story that they would listen to. And so I thought, well, what if I isolated so that you just saw the mouth and hands? Because by limiting a visual thing, again, instead of all the visual being spelled out for you, what if you limit it? It becomes a sort of mesmerizing thing, right? Have you ever been to a rock concert where you're 10 miles away and the person is there and they're in the light, and you get this tunnel thing that happens where you're watching them, but you just feel like sucked into this pinhole of this, and I wanted that kind of pulling the person in to this mouth and hands. It's also a nod to Samuel Beckett, to a piece called Not I, which is just the mouth, where he just has that, who's one of my idols. So I was like, well, what if I isolate it and I tell this story, will they still get the monster? Like, I think our inner monster is so much scarier than any monster I could paint. And so that was the goal, was to sort of engage by giving a focal point to the visual. So you had a visual, you were compelled into something, but you're listening intently and hearing this story, and then you create the world. The world becomes of your own individual. So here you are doing this one single thing on stage, and there are all these people that are having an individual experience too, which is of course what we want, right? We want people to bring themselves to a performance and connect with them each individually. So that's working.
Amazing. Wow. What do you think about his work? What do you think about his writing?
Well, I mean, Jabberwocky particularly has a vocabulary, that he explains. So it's nonsense, but at the same time it has roots. he was a scholar, you know. When we talk about some of these, 'twas brillig and the slithy, lithe and slimy, right? So these words are defined by Humpty Dumpty in one of the scenes. One of my favorites is, and the mome wraths wave in the wave. What wave means is way before it, way beyond it, way beside it. So that's part of what was inspiring, was to, how can I convey a word, and this is true of all language really, and a lot in poetry, that the word is a portal to an image and to an emotion or an idea, right? So he does this so eloquently, because we don't know what Wabe means in and of itself, but if we know his backstory or his vocabulary, then we know that for me, the way that I say it is Wabe. I stretch it because I'm imagining the space around it, right? Mome means far from home, and the mome rats are green pigs, out grabbing and raping, So you're telling the story through, this distillation of the ideas into these little words. So I think that's what I find so exciting about language in general, but in particular this fantastical language, where we've got this one little word, but it actually has so much beyond it that we can express. So that's what I was doing when I was exploring the piece, was like, how can my voice convey all of these wonderful images and things that he's trying to put into that one word?
Yeah, and I feel like it is, what makes it easier for the audience is the fact that it is like a storytelling piece.
No question, that's really essential, right? That we keep telling the story, keep it along. What do you find exciting about it?
Oh God,
about the language.
Just how almost, I don't want to call it silly, but there is like a playfulness to it, and it's just an incredibly violent story. Like he left it dead, and with his head he went galumphing back.
Right. So yeah, I think that I had actually, somebody recently heard me do it, was saying, I didn't really think about how violent that story is. Well, yeah, the boy goes out with his sword and fights the monster, and so I think it happens very fast when you're telling the story. This is also the relationship of music or musical time in this sense, right, to language, in that we change the time. So I was able to sort of suspend that, open up that, because if you read the poem in its rhythm, it's like, 1, 2, 1, 2, and through his vorpal blade went snickersack. He took its head, and with it, he left it dead, and with its head. Well, it's sort of like, for me, he takes off its head, and then he looks at it, So we're able to sort of suspend the moments more when we add music to it, right? Or even just for me, as you see in the score, the Jabberwock. Just the sight of the monster alone needs a little bit of space, right?
Yeah.
A little bit of vocal space, a little bit of percussive, the battle happens in that word for me.
And I guess just to end it all, first of all, thank you again for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for doing it.
Of course. What do you hope let me get this wording exactly. What do you hope to convey to your audience? Like, what do you hope that they get out of this experience?
Well, I hope that they are engaged into their own imagination. And I think that, storytelling is such a great art. it's always, there's something universal in this story. We all have monsters. We all have conflict. So even if we just think about it from I think a good story transports us, and maybe through the emotion of that story, it's the age-old catharsis of the Greeks, right? Through engaging through it, even if it's not specifically our story, the emotion of it is something that we travel along with and we connect with and feel that we've been through something with the performers, and it's just something that resonates with us. That's what I hope. Actually, I think I hope that with all my music, that it resonates, in some way. Maybe it doesn't have to be even articulated in some specific way, but that it's just, it reaches people.
Well, I'm sure it will, because it is a wonderful piece.
It's gonna reach out. You're gonna reach out. Scare them.
Oh, yeah. It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun.
It's a workout, isn't it?
It is.